Do you like dying? How about being trapped in an endless cycle of torment, misery, and despair with ironic punishments from malevolent forces beyond human understanding, all while you're trapped in an unending demiplane trying its very best to make you become part of the nightmare yourself? If the answer is yes, well then come on down to Ravenloft. Dungeons & Dragons' infamous Ravenloft is one of the most popular settings, and for good reason. Starting way back in the 80s from a very simple question at a gaming table, which was, why is there a vampire hanging out in this random dungeon? What's his story? With this little spark leading to generations of source books, novels, video games, and just about everything else you can imagine. So in this video, I'm going to dive into the history of this beloved setting, its highs and lows over the years, its various adaptations, and where everything is at today to explore whatever happened to Ravenloft. Hi everyone, my name is Otto, and welcome to Exits Examined. We'll be exploring series, franchises, and more after their prime time has seemingly come to an end. If that sounds good to you, there's a like and subscribe button below, and I want to give a huge shout out to my patrons who make this channel possible. You guys rock. Okay, so Ravenloft is one of those things that can quickly spiral out of control in an instant, going from bad to worse faster than you can blink. But let's start with the basics. Ravenloft is hands down one of the darkest, most horrific, and generally miserable settings ever conceived by man. Dramatic, maybe, but not by much. It all started way back in 1983 with some pretty humble beginnings as a single adventure module for D&D, basically a prepackaged story for groups to play through. But of course, people couldn't get enough of this twisted, messed up setting, and before long, it exploded into a full-blown campaign setting with its own dark, twisted universe. And this is where things can get a little tricky and confusing, because the name Ravenloft actually pulls double or maybe even triple duty. Originally, it was just the name of Castle Ravenloft, the creepy setting in that first D&D adventure module, but as the setting expanded, Ravenloft started referring to the entire campaign setting itself, and then it morphed into the name for all the delightfully named domains of dread, and trust me, we'll be diving into those much more later. So yeah, if you're just coming into this without approaching it as it was released during its time, it can get a little messy. But hey, don't get hung up on it. What really matters is this. Literally every inch of this world is trying to kill you, deceive you, or at best trap you. And at worst, it'll turn you into a twisted, living monstrosity for all of eternity. Now, I've heard Ravenloft described to me as hell for those who would enjoy hell, and honestly, that's about as accurate as you can get. Basically, picture something like this. You're stuck in a bunch of nightmare-fueled worlds, and your only company is made up of the most evil, deranged, and powerful people in the multiverse. Basically, imagine if Pinhead from Hellraiser had his own world, was in charge of all the decor, and got trapped there forever. Now, imagine that somehow you ended up there too, and Pinhead is bored out of his mind, just waiting for someone to mess with. Those are Ravenloft's Dark Lords in a nutshell. Twisted, unstoppable, and absolutely trapped in their own little hells. But here's the kicker. They're not even the worst things you'll face, because controlling it all is something even darker and worse, which are the dark powers who pull the strings in the background. All sounds super fun, right? So to really paint the picture here, let's take the original OG Castle Ravenloft that started it all as an example. Quote, "Inhuman shapes slip between crumbling tombs. The shadows reach forth. Do instincts and imagination conspire against you, or have otherworldly evils claimed you, drawing you into the mist of Ravenloft?" End quote. Ravenloft can be described as many things, but gothic horror has got to be up there. Dark, gloomy castles, desolate landscapes, black clouds racing against the moon, and the dreaded Castle Ravenloft in Barovia, home of the notorious Strahd Van Zarovich, who is quite literally inseparable from Ravenloft. Strahd is often called one of D&D's sexiest villains, and while having one of the most outrageous Eastern European names, he's immensely powerful, well-nigh indestructible, and fun to roleplay, and also a bit angsty. That being said, he is the central figure in the story. Ravenloft is all about its villain. Quote, "I am the Ancient. My beginnings are lost in the darkness of the past. I am not dead, nor am I alive. I am undead forever." End quote. But Strahd, sexy as he is, isn't just your typical Dracula knockoff. Sure, he's got the whole sinister, brooding thing down, but beneath all that melodrama, he's actually just an angsty little emo boy with an unhealthy middle school obsession with his unrequited love. So to make this long, tragic, and definitely horror-filled story short, Strahd wasn't exactly born to an easy life. He spent his youth fighting in a brutal, endless war against the D&D Turkish Empire. After surviving the blood-soaked chaos against all odds, emerging victorious, he was robbed of his innocence, optimism, and, let's be honest, any chance of ever having a live, laugh, love sign hanging on his wall. On the plus side, he can finally settle down and start building his own castle, which, you guessed it, was called Ravenloft, and he called his family over to join him, which was not exactly a happy family reunion. Strahd's mother dies on the way to the castle, and although his brother Sergei does make it, well, he's the exact opposite of Strahd, young and optimistic. And Sergei, poor guy, just wants to be friends with his older brother, who increasingly gets more and more jealous of Sergei's youth, especially when Sergei brings along his new love interest, Tatiana. Now, Strahd gets a little what you might call obsessive. He starts wooing her with gifts and the like, but Tatiana, as a presumably healthy and well-balanced person who genuinely is in love with Sergei, just sees Strahd as an older brother. Yikes all around. So instead of, getting therapy or just moving on, Strahd takes the second best option and goes full on villain mode and strikes a deal with a dark, ominous force he delightfully refers to as death. Basically, he gains immortality and hopefully Tatiana's love for the small price of, well, blood. So Strahd seals the deal, then heads back to the castle where Sergei and Tatiana are about to get married, and this is going to go down exactly as well as you might imagine. Strahd kills his brother, confesses his undying love for Tatiana, and surprise, surprise, she is horrified. She balks, and in a desperate attempt to escape, she throws herself off the castle, taking her own life, while Strahd's own guards, understandably being very confused about what's happening, start to shoot him. But of course, he doesn't die and rises again, becoming the first vampire bound forever to Barovia, cursed to always chase after reincarnations of Tatiana that are forever just beyond his grasp. Now, this all might you believe that Strahd is something of a tragic figure, and in some ways he is, but under the surface we have to remember that he truly is a monster through and through, and in the words of creator Tracy Hickamn, quote, "He's a selfish beast forever lurking behind a mask of tragic romance, the illusion of redemption that was ever only camouflage for his prey," end quote. And in gameplay, what makes him so terrifying is that he is the one in control, always with a plan, always executing it with precision. And you're just a pawn in his grand scheme, a temporary diversion to keep him entertained for a while. He'll invite you to dinner, play around with you, and will only resort to physical violence as a last resort. And even then, he just kind of sighs because he already knows the outcome. After all, he is Giga Chad Strahd, and you're in his domain. Did you really think you had a chance? After living what can only be described as a rich and colorful life, or more accurately, multiple lives here, he's got what you might call class. And Strahd was one of the first truly fleshed out villains in D&D, and a lot of this was because of his deeply humanizing backstory. He's not just some random evil dude, he's a tragic figure doomed to repeat his violent cycle over and over. But let's be clear, it's not just Strahd who makes this setting iconic. Barovia itself has a certain je ne sais quoi that starts working its creepy magic the moment you step in. For starters, there's this fog that isn't your average spooky mist. Once you inhale it, it wraps itself around your vital organs, ready to kill you if you leave. Once you get past that lovely poison mist trying to kill you, you'll likely stumble into the village of Barovia, an utterly delightful, and by delightful I mean soul-crushingly bleak place where the locals live in constant fear, depression, and suspicion. The village of Barovia is a ghost town in more ways than one. Claw marks are all over the doors and buildings, and most of the shops are shuttered, and the ones that are open sell at 10 times the normal price because hey, where else are you gotta go? And then there's the ambience. Random sobs or moans drift down the street from just as delightfully named Mad Mary's townhouse, complete with their own tragic backstory. Now, you might think you'll find some peace or solace at the local church. Well, LOL, my friends. True, by day, the church feels like a bit of a fragile sanctuary, but come midnight, hundreds of spirits rise from the graveyard and march up the road to Castle Ravenloft. Now, you might think you'd find some respite outside the village, but more than likely you'll just find some wolves and other beasts under Strahd's control, and at best you'll find the Vistani, who are a can of worms all on their own. Picture them as an extremely loose interpretation of the real-world's Romani, only with a bit more flair and a lot more shadowy, mystical power. The Vistani are complicated in a few ways, sometimes friends, sometimes foes, and often a little bit of both. But one thing is for sure, they're definitely connected to Strahd, and if not outright allied to him, at least serving as his eyes and ears. Now, older D&D products portrayed the Vistani in a very negative and some would say stereotypical way. And even as recently as Curse of Strahd, they were portrayed as untrustworthy, drunk, and thieves. But recently, Wizards of the Coast has pivoted away from that. Now, speaking of Ravenloft, we can't talk about Barovia without mentioning Castle Ravenloft itself, which is quite literally looming over everything. It's the ominous centerpiece of the entire realm, perched dramatically on a 1,000-foot rock in classic horror fashion, and it's definitely got this ultimate final boss vibe. Grand, gothic, and packed with secrets that only the most daring or foolish would want to uncover. One of the most interesting things is that every single room is described in detail, with their own unique encounters, traps, and events, and the place is huge. If you manage to get inside, you'll find grand dining halls with immaculate banquets, dungeons that sprawl into the unknown, and of course catacombs, which all have their own fair share of horrors as you might imagine. But interestingly, it's not all doom and gloom down here. For example, you might just pass the tomb of Admiral Spinwitovich, with inscriptions that say, quote, "Confused though he was, he built the greatest naval force ever assembled in a landlocked country," end quote. But anyway, you get a sense that Ravenloft used to be a place of splendor and treasure, but make no mistake, in the modern day, it's fallen into a twisted, dark version of itself, much like the reflection of Strahd. And of course, it's also packed to the brim with monsters and other fun little terrible characters like Strahd's accountant, who is chained to his desk and has been there longer than he can remember. Or you might also stumble upon what appears to be an innocent girl who will plead, if necessary, to be saved from this awful place, only to eventually try to munch on you with her vampire fangs when your back is turned. So, somehow, one way or another, you manage to escape, and you might think, wow, that was dark and messed up, but at least it's over. Well, I truly admire your optimism, but let's just say you do manage to slip out of Ravenloft. While you're pushing through the fog, you're just as likely to wander right into one of the many other terrifying realms within this demiplane. Yes, that's right. Ravenloft is just one piece of an entire world with over 50 of these, and each of them are delightfully twisted and awful in their own right. So what's the deal here? As I mentioned, Ravenloft isn't just the name of a castle, it's the name of an entire demiplane, the Demiplane of Dread, or the Land of Mist. This place is a collection of landmasses known as domains, each ruled by a Dark Lord who's both the master and prisoner of their own personal hell. So for example, Strahd is the first Dark Lord bound forever to suffer in Barovia. And as a fun little twist, you can get trapped in these domains anytime, anywhere with little warning. The Demiplanes of Dread don't play by the usual rules. Time warps, logic gets tossed out of the window, and the whole place feels like a fever dream. You might escape one domain only to find yourself squarely dropped into another, just as dangerous and bizarre. Now, each domain has its own unique flavor, different currency, language, religion, culture, and tech level. Some domains feel like they're straight out of Victorian times, while others are more medieval or primitive, and it's hard to overstate just how much content there actually is here, because each of the domains have their own history, which themselves can span centuries. Now, interestingly, each of them embody their own type of horror. Lovecraftian, body horror, you name it, it's there. So obviously I can't list all of the countless ones there are, but a few standouts to give you a nice little terrifying taste are Lamortia, which is basically one big Frankenstein homage, complete with mad scientists and all the fun monstrosities they try to create. Then you also got more interesting ones like Carnival, which is essentially a time-traveling nightmare carnival that travels all around the Demiplanes. And then you even have domains like Mass of the Red Death, which is set on Earth in the late 1800s, where your characters focus on surviving a plague-ridden London straight out of Edgar Allan Poe's short story, which it was named after. If that's not enough for you, you also got places like O'Dare, which is just straight up filled with evil dolls, creepy puppets, and sentient marionettes. So you can really pick and choose the exact terrible horror you want, because we got everything here. And even if somehow you take a look at this and you're like, this is good, but not messed up in quite the way I want, well, good news in gameplay, you can actually create your own. Now, if all of this sounds like pure chaos, an insane mashup of horrors, well, you're not wrong, but it's surprisingly structured too. Ravenloft has a map and a center called the Core, which is the main cluster of nations forming the major continent, and kind of considered the heart of the setting. The more exotic or unusual domains are typically islands or part of pocket domains, basically smaller domains within larger ones that can move around and shift positions, adding even more unpredictability to the landscape. Now, the mists I was talking about earlier kind of act as shifting borders between the Demiplanes and the rest of the material world, and they're kind of constantly ebbing and flowing and never really fixed. And theoretically, you could walk from one end of the core to another, but this would obviously be extremely dangerous and I wouldn't recommend it. Now, when talking about the domains, you cannot ignore their Dark Lords. Just like Strahd and Barovia, a domain and its Dark Lord are inseparable. Now, these Dark Lords are often near immortal and almost all-powerful in their realms, which at first sounds pretty sweet, right? But then you actually realize the entire point of their realms is to torture them, and what's even more terrifying is that some of them don't even realize that they're Dark Lords or even trapped. Now, some of these are straight up legendary figures, complete with their own extremely long and generally terrible and miserable fleshed out stories, like with the fan favorite Lord Soth. Yes, that Lord Soth, originally from Dragonlance, and if you feel like sometimes the lore from D&D is like Charlie from It's Always Sunny, yes, you're not wrong. Anyway, it's not like these Dark Lords are necessarily static. A lot of times they have their own relationships, rivalries, and even frenemies. Cough cough, looking at you, Jonder. But even though the Dark Lords are undeniably cool, a lot of times they don't really take center stage, instead lingering in the background, which is kind of more terrifying. Now, the Dark Lords can be fairly one-note, like the literal lady killer Bluebeard, because just like IRL, if you ask any girl, she'll tell you nothing is hotter than a Bluebeard. But you also have more meta and nuanced things like a literal house being a Dark Lord. Now, the more astute among you, which I'm sure is all of you, might have had a thought. How could these terribly OP Dark Lords be prisoners? What on earth could possibly trap them? Well, just like Dragon Ball Z, there is always a higher power level because the Dark Lords are subservient, knowingly or unknowingly, to something fun called the Dark Powers. What are the Dark Powers? Well, short answer is no one knows. Some people speculate and call them different things, but in lore, it's pretty purposely left vague. What we do know is that the Dark Powers are the mysterious force that has presumably created the Demiplane of Ravenloft, both empowering and cursing the Dark Lords. Basically, if you commit some terrible act, murdering your wife / mass murder, the Dark Powers will take notice of you and you might just get your own little domain. And it's interesting to think that even if you manage to escape the Dark Lords or somehow defeat them, no matter what, there's always some greater unknowable evil forces lurking out there that's beyond your comprehension. Fun, right? What's also important to note here is that the different planes, Dark Lords, monsters, these aren't just afterthoughts. They have hundreds and hundreds of pages written about them within the lore. And when it comes down to it, the amount of lore and story here is absolutely staggering. Do you want to know in-depth detail about how to create your own Frankenstein monstrosities, including materials, magic, and psychology? Well, congratulations, there's an almost 100-page manual out there just for you. How about the same for vampire, ghost, and fiends? Don't know what a fiend even is? Don't worry, here's another 100-page book. If you take together all the books, revisions, adventures, monster books, it can quickly feel like you're in your own Demiplane of Dread. But hey, if you're into Ravenloft, you probably like a bit of pain anyway. Now, if you want to learn more about the lore here, shout out to Hour of the Raven and Ravenloft Tour Guide, which are excellent channels that'll give you more lore on the setting, which is really cool. So, like I mentioned, it's easy to get lost in the black hole and at times wormhole of lore and retcons, which, oh my god, there are a lot of retcons. Pretty much every edition, novel, character, and backstories have wildly changed over the years, and don't even get me started on the Grand Conjunction. But anyway, with all this general nuttiness going on, let's not forget that this is an actual game. So the question is, what is it like to play? Well, with all things in Ravenloft, the answer is complicated, and a lot of it depends on which version you're playing. Now, if you're talking about the good old OG Ravenloft the Adventure with our boy Strahd way back in 1E, it's pretty much a classic step-by-step adventure with every encounter and room mapped out. It also introduced some really innovative mechanics which were totally on theme for it. One of the standouts for me was the imitation card reading, which in later versions would basically be D&D Tarot. Now, these would randomize some elements of gameplay, and this, on top of Strahd as a mechanic, led to great replayability. So basically, to explain Strahd, he was a component in the game, and unlike even a lot of modern games, cough cough, looking at you Dark Souls, he wasn't just a boss hanging out in the final room twiddling his thumb. He actively tried to hinder players, and if he knew he was outmatched, he'd retreat until he had the advantage, and it's hard to state just how revolutionary this was. And then there were the maps, which were just incredible and absolute game changers. So to try to illustrate this for a good amount of people who weren't playing D&D in the 70s, which I understand, take something like the Caves of Chaos, a classic starter dungeon which was par for the course for dungeons at the time. It was fun, but felt a bit chaotic, like someone tossed a bunch of rooms in a blender and called it a day. Ravenloft, though, was a different beast entirely. The map felt gorgeous and like you were actually walking through a real castle, not just navigating a maze. Everything was structured with purpose, making exploration feel immersive and strategic. Honestly, it's hard not to be a little in love with how well it all fits together, and it was just a beautiful space to look at and get excited to play. Now, don't get me wrong, it wasn't all roses and sexy vampires. Ravenloft did come with its fair share of criticism. One big sticking point was that it shifted the spotlight to NPCs, sometimes at the expense of player agency. Some players and DMs felt that this clashed with what D&D was supposed to be, a sandbox where imagination reigned and stories were shaped by the players themselves. The ending of Ravenloft, for example, felt more predetermined and centered around Strahd rather than the player characters. Now, for some that was fine, but for others it really felt limiting. Then there's something of its tainted legacy within D&D as a whole. Now, the success of Ravenloft and also Dragonlance marked a huge turning point for D&D, paving the way for more narrative-driven adventures with overarching meta storylines and rich characters. We have to remember that D&D started as this super sandbox format where the dungeon masters were supposed to make up pretty much everything and do all the heavy lifting of the narrative. The new meta plots often left a bad taste in DM's mouth, with evolving background stories putting you in a situation where your old books could be made obsolete by new ones as the lore changed. Ravenloft, for better or worse, would totally shift the direction of D&D as a whole in the decades to come, and we're still feeling the ramification of this decades later to this day. And that's just classic Ravenloft. We haven't even touched on gameplay for all the other domains, and trust me, there are a ton of them. But what ties these varied domains together in terms of aesthetic is generally the overwhelming sense of helplessness and creeping loss of control. In Ravenloft, it's the setting and, by extension, the Dark Lords holding the reins as you, the player, feel out of your familiar elements, facing a constant undercurrent of dread and desperation, fighting battles with your back against a wall in a land that doesn't want you here and is beyond comprehension, and is also trying its best to horrify you into submission. Sometimes when typing out descriptions for Ravenloft, it really makes me wonder what is wrong with humanity if this is the type of stuff we do in our spare time. Anyway, this terror and horror comes out in gameplay, and a lot of Ravenloft books actually start with a warning to DMs reminding them to have a conversation with their players about limits, but it's not just about setting boundaries. Horror and madness, which would later be changed to stress checks, are an integral part of every Ravenloft adventure. As a DM, you're encouraged to dial up the fear and dread, putting players in situations that mess with them emotionally. It's not just about scaring them, it's about breaking down their will bit by bit, which again, what a lovely setting. There are other gameplay additions in Ravenloft too, and some of them do feel like set dressing, but others are much more substantial, like the Dark Gifts. These let you gain new proficiencies or abilities from forces beyond your understanding with a bit of a price attached, and some of these gifts are seriously horrifying. For example, one of them is having a second being living inside your body that physically manifests somewhere on you. In exchange, it offers knowledge and assistance either willingly or because your fates are tied together, but don't think for a second that it's always all good, because this is a straight up separate being with its own personality and agenda. At the end of the day, Ravenloft is a sandbox. Players are encouraged to make their own domains, their own Dark Lords, and it really does make great horror Lego bricks, if you will, for your own fun, twisted, terrible worlds. And quick question, what is the most terrible Ravenloft world you have or would make? And now I know I'm going to get flooded with Clown World comments below. So this is all great stuff. So how did it actually happen if it was so radically different from all the other D&D stuff at the time? Well, as with many great things, it all started in the early 80s when future D&D designer Tracy Hickamn had a vampire encounter during one of his first D&D games, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it just felt weird. A vampire popping up in a dungeon full of goblins and oozes? Nah, it just didn't sit right. Vampires were supposed to be classy, with intrigue, sexy even, one might say. So Tracy and his wife decided to answer these questions of why this vampire was here. I mean, like, what does he even want? So they made their own vampire, complete with a backstory and setting to match it, which would become Project Vampire, which they playtested every Halloween, and over time it evolved into something much bigger, especially after the Hickmans joined TSR, which was the company behind D&D. Now this would eventually lead to the original Ravenloft module in 1983 for first edition D&D. So if the looks of the shadowy, twisted world of Ravenloft has left you eager to dive headfirst into its blood-soaked, madness-riddled depths, I totally get it. But do you know what's even better than venturing into Ravenloft? Doing it with dice that are as quality and as captivating as the Ravenloft setting itself. Today's sponsor, Die Hard Dice, is a small and passionate team of in-house alchemists and artificers who pour their love for tabletop RPGs into every handcrafted set of dice. And some of these are seriously incredible. We got some like the Sanguine Call, which is inspired by none other than our boy Strahd himself, and is a seriously beautiful design and an absolute labor of love. It's also perfectly fitting for the haunted halls of Castle Ravenloft or any campaign where you want a touch of that gothic flair. Now, if you're like me and this dark gift is calling your name, you're in luck. Die Hard Dice is running a holiday sale with a loot tier system. Spend $30 or more and you'll be eligible for some savings. And you can save as much as $150 if you hit the highest level. As a little bonus, just for you being awesome, you can also use the discount code EXITS10 at checkout to get 10% off on your first order. And I'm happy to support these guys. Again, the discount code is EXITS10 at checkout to get 10% off your first order. So speaking of the first edition, in this dreadful, terrible, miserable world of Ravenloft, there's been one thing I've personally been more terrified of than anything else, and that's explaining what actually makes up Ravenloft, as in what are the source books and media that collectively make up the setting. And with a product as long-lasting as Ravenloft that has been around for decades throughout different authors, owners, and literal generations, there's been everything thrown in here from pirates, Lovecraftian horror, and of course the kitchen sink. So let's break down its rocky history one by one. Now, sure, things start simple enough with the original Ravenloft Adventure module in 1983, which consisted of a 32-page book. Now, I mentioned that this adventure was massively popular, and as such, it quickly got a sequel, Ravenloft 2: The House on Griffin Hill, in 1986, again with Tracy and Laura Hickamn as authors. Now, they did leave before the module was complete. So the first edition of D&D is nice and tidy, right? Well, enjoy this brief moment of peace while it lasts, because in second edition, things quickly spiral into an absolute insane mess, and I'm still not confident anyone knows with 100% certainty all of the media that was published for it, but here it goes. It all started deceptively simple with Ravenloft Realm of Terror box set in 1990, which is pretty much the Ravenloft Bible, and many people still swear by this version today. It's really a thing of beauty, packed with cards, illustration, and gorgeous maps. This was a big deal, both then and now, because it brought the entire world of Ravenloft to life, and this is where Ravenloft expanded from beyond just Barovia into the sprawling Demiplanes of Dread, and this would go on to get 2 major revisions. Now, this is where things went completely insane, because between 1990 and 2000, by my count, there were over 60 adventure modules, expansions, and accessories. Basically, if you could slap the Ravenloft name on it, it got made. Now, to be fair, a lot of these focused on the new domains of Dread, and each one had its own unique world, history, Dark Lord, and gameplay mechanics, so it made sense to have new stories and media that would go into detail about them. So, for example, with Adam's Wrath being about the new Frankenstein-esque Lemortia, or Mask of the Death fleshing out its own Edgar Allan Poe-inspired world. But where it just becomes too much are the accessories. Now, these vary in quality, and the authors are all different too, and some of them are admittedly interesting, but some just take things way too far, diving into absurd detail on monsters and counters, taking that unhinged Ravenloft energy to the max. Now, these include Ravenloft Children of the Night Ghost, Introduction to the Land of Mist, Books of Crypts, and way more random stuff in here, like an audio CD adventure, which I just don't have the time to get into. And don't even get me started on Van Richten, who is basically D&D's version of Van Helsing. He's this legendary hunter of dark, terrible beasts, and he writes these in-universe books explaining the various monsters and their ecology, and these are filled with info on what motivates the monsters, their weaknesses, and in some cases what happens to a player character who is turned into a monster, like a werewolf or a ghost, which is great. I love in-universe books like that really pull you into the setting. But here's my issue. Van Richten's Guide to Vampires, Van Richten's Guide to Ghost, Van Richten's Guide to the Lich, Van Richten's Guide to the Werebeast, Van Richten's Guide to the Created, and so on and so on. And so the question is, WTF TSR, why aren't these just one book? And yes, I know that they were eventually compiled into one book, but that wasn't much later until 2014. Well, the answer with all things in life comes down to money. At the time, TSR was really trying to stay afloat and had this really weird loan system. They would take out a prepayment loan for every book printed and then return any unsold copies for a refund, as long as they kept cranking out books and selling just enough they could keep the lights on. But the downside is that this would eventually lead to TSR's downfall, and the other problem is that it made it nearly impossible for any sane person to collect everything. Now, if this isn't all enough to get your head spinning, well, take a shot and man up, because many of these 2E releases were going on with an overarching meta plot in the background, and this was called the Grand Conjunction. Now, for the sake of everyone's sanity, and to try to keep this bloated video on track, I'm just going to give you the bullet points on this. Basically, in lore terms, one of the big bad Dark Lords, Azalin Rex, very nearly released the Dark Lords into the material plane, but long story short, this cute little guy made a kerfuffle in his big excitement to get out, and in doing so messed up a lot of things, to put it mildly. In gameplay terms, the devs used this to tweak the world and correct what they saw as errors, removing lands seen as superfluous. Now, what's even more fun is that this wasn't even the last time this happened in the universe, because later there was a smaller version called the Grim Harvest, but for my sanity, as well as yours, let's just get the out of 2E Ravenloft, because oh yeah, we're still in 2E and the timeline. Oh yeah, but in getting out of 2E, we actually have to go through Die Vecna Die in 2000. Now this was interesting because it's divided into 3 sections, taking players on an adventure through Greyhawk, then into Ravenloft, and finally ending with a showdown in Planescape, ending with the multiversal order changing. Now, most people interpret this as the basic mechanics of the universe changing from 2E to 3E. So if you thought 3E was going to make things any less confusing, well, welcome to Ravenloft, baby. It's best to just embrace the chaos, misery, and darkness at this point. First off, Wizards of the Coast took over D&D, and the very first thing they did was hand the Ravenloft license to White Wolf as a part of their push to outsource non-core development. Now, they did try their best to stay true to the original canon while adding their own spin. Now, 3E often gets brushed off in Ravenloft history. Most people just give it like a sentence or two, which is a shame because there's a ton of great stuff going on here, and the gameplay is more lethal and reliant on player ingenuity, which made for some really exciting stuff. Lore-wise, special shout out to the Gazetteers, which were these deep dive source books. They were a huge effort to turn Ravenloft into a living, breathing setting, giving tons of details about culture, geography, and how the domains interacted, stuff that 2E never really touched on. You got things like local dishes to clothing style of peasants, all told through the lens of the mysterious S, who is a super compelling and interesting character in their own right. There was also just a ton of other content released during this time, which again seems to be glossed over by a ton of people, including its own core rulebook for 3E. Now, some people say that 3E started strong in the early 2000s, but lost steam into 2005, and eventually, Wizards of the Coast got the Ravenloft license back, but due to a weird technicality in the rights timeline, the Ravenloft supplement, Van Richten's Guide to the Mist, never saw print, and instead White Wolf released it as a free download. Anyway, Wizards came back with Expedition to Castle Ravenloft, which gave their own spin on the original adventure, with several of these ideas making their way into 4E and 5E. Speaking of 4E, there really wasn't that much Ravenloft in there, which may or may not have been for the better with the seismic differences that edition sparked, which angered a lot of fans. But that doesn't mean that there was totally nothing in here, because in 2012 Dungeon Magazine did feature the Fair Barovia adventure set in Barovia, and of course our boy Strahd, but to be fair, he's only in there briefly. But overall, Ravenloft at this point was pretty humbled after all the back and forth with White Wolf and fan backlash over 4E, and luckily Wizards turned to the two people who could capture the magic again, who were of course none other than the Hickmans. Now, Curse of Strahd dropped in 2016, and it's impossible to overstate how much this reinvigorated the setting, and if you're looking at Ravenloft images now, this is probably the one you're going to see. Now, the Hickmans, instead of reinventing the wheel, concentrated on a constrained micro setting, diving deep into a small, well-developed area without the pressure of needing to connect it to everything else. It's a sandbox-style adventure with the focus on making the areas and characters feel real and significant to the story. There are a few hiccups, but overall it builds on the existing Ravenloft material and gives a fresh take on the familiar gothic horror tropes. I also want to talk for a second about how much of an aesthetic leap we've taken too between the decades. I think Strahd is a great example of this, because way back in the 80s, Strahd was looking all types of Bela Lugosi, but in 2015, because everything has to be sexier in the modern day, Strahd is looking like a real millennial dapper daddy, so if that's your thing, well, hats off to you. Now, Curse of Strahd was just a prelude to what was to come, because then we got Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft in 2021, and this was the big one, a whole campaign source book, with overviews of the domains of Dread and an excellent 20-page adventure called The House of Lament. It also included new elements and mechanics, including new subclasses and that dark gift mechanic I mentioned before. So how is it? Well, the reception has been, let's just say, mixed. A lot of people love the ideas, but here's the thing. Ideas are great, but without the details, they don't really hit the mark, and the entire thing feels wide but not deep. Now, I totally get why they kept things broad, because there's only so much space in one book, and not everyone wants to be buried in lore. Plus, it's probably a smart move for new DMs who might get overwhelmed by too much detail, but still it feels like there could just be more depth here, right? But hey, if you don't like something in the setting, you can always just make your own terrible special domain too. So what about those of you out there who, like me, don't have any friends to play D&D with, or don't have the time or resources to purchase thousands of books to play campaigns with, but you still like the campaign setting? Well, you, my friends, are A, not alone, and B, there are also other ways to get into Ravenloft without all that D&D nerd stuff. Most notably, there's actually a surprisingly large amount of adaptations, with the most numerous definitely being the books. Now, there are over 20 of these bad boys, and as they've all been written by different authors, they all, as you might expect, vary in quality. Most of them deal with specific Dark Lords and their origin stories, their interactions, and just general evil shenanigans, but some of these are genuinely compelling stories. So, for example, many people will comment that Vampire of the Mist is one of the best books, and it's all about Jander Sunstar, a former elf-turned-vampire who got trapped in the Demiplane of Dread and his frenemy relationship with none other than Strahd himself. Now, speaking of Strahd, we of course got books about him, including I, Strahd, The Memoirs of a Vampire, going all into the terrible and miserable details of his descent to becoming everyone's favorite Dark Lord. If you wanted to know more about a particular Dark Lord or domain, chances are there's a book out there for you. Now, most of these were released in the early 90s in conjunction with the explosion of products in those wily 2E years, as well as some AD&D adventure game books like Master of Ravenloft, which was kind of like a choose-your-own adventure book. But after a brief break in the early 2000s, we also got a smattering of new books around 2008, which was something of a reboot, and these included Heaven's Bones and Black Crusade. Now, if you think reading is for losers and you can only get excited if you visually see a vampire rip someone in half, 1, I understand, and 2, don't feel left out because there actually are some Ravenloft comics out there for you. These were published by ADW, and within these, we got the 5-issue Shadow of the Vampire in 2016, featuring Strahd and Ravenloft as its main setting. Then in 2022, we got a 4-issue limited series called Orphan of Agony Isle, which was focused on the D&D Frankenstein Lamortia. Now, personally, I'm just so excited that comics are even a thing in Ravenloft because I had no idea that these existed. Now, actually, like with a ton of other settings in D&D, there was a good amount of Ravenloft video games in the early 90s, and surprisingly, a few of these were actually pretty solid. We got Ravenloft Strahd's Possession in 1994, as well as its follow-up Stone Prophet, which were pretty classic old-school real-time FPS RPGs, and these were surprisingly deep and nuanced games with different NPCs that could join your party, and if you're interested in deep dives, I would definitely recommend William SRD's video on them. In a completely and utterly different bizarre direction, we also got Iron and Blood Warriors of Ravenloft on PlayStation 1 in 1996, and this is a fighting game kind of like a terrible version of Soul Calibur, and maybe the worst genre fit for this setting, but actually thinking about it more, it could have worked if they just tweaked it a bit, maybe making some type of Super Smash Brothers where all the Dark Lords fought. This could have been totally awesome, but what do I know? There's also been some expansions for other games throughout the years, including Dungeons & Dragons Online, Mist of Ravenloft, and even as recently as 2018, there was a Ravenloft expansion for Neverwinter, which, of course, because Neverwinter has everything. This was as janky as you might think, but as far as modern RPGs, this is probably the closest we got, which sucks because this setting would absolutely slap as a modern-day RPG. Honestly, screw throwing money at Hogwarts Legacy, I would kill for a fleshed out RPG in Ravenloft. Even if it's not like a AAA game, I'm just salivating at the thoughts of a Kinshi type game where you bounce around the different domains, getting enslaved/trap, and I think we can all agree that we need that. Now, even though we don't have a fleshed out modern game, we do actually have a board game in 2010 creatively called Castle Ravenloft, the board game, and in classic Ravenloft fashion, it is extremely hard and difficult to win. You will definitely lose some games, but it's all in good fun, and there's probably a good drinking game to be made somewhere within here. But the big question is, are we getting any more official Ravenloft content? Well, here's the deal. For 5e, I think it's extremely likely we pretty much hit the limit with Curse of Strahd and Van Richten's Guide, although we have gotten some recent releases set in the Ravenloft universe like Vecna Eve of Ruin that has its own fair share of drama. Now, even though there's not any gameplay stuff on the horizon, that's not to say there's nothing. We also got a new Ravenloft novel which recently released called Heir of Strahd. That said, whatever new edition of D&D there is in the future, I think it's extremely likely there's going to be more Ravenloft content, and definitely there'll be some type of 10th anniversary release of Curse of Strahd. After all, Ravenloft is just too popular to not at least get something in the future. It's consistently been one of the most played settings for decades, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. But even if there's not a ton of new material on the horizon, I think it's fine because it's the Ravenloft fandom itself and the community that really keeps this going, and the fandom is huge, with one of the biggest Reddits out there and some of the most intense fan creations I've ever seen. These include fan-made modules, fanzines, and some mad lads even made an enormous 7-foot printable Ravenloft castle, which I'm happy to say recently reached its Kickstarter. And honestly, thank God for the internet, because there's also been some great meme stuff too, with this incredible spoof Friend Show intro, but with Strahd. Chef's kiss is just so great. And it's so cool that this nearly 30-year-old setting that probably no one thought at the time would take off would go on to become one of the most popular settings of D&D history. So the question is, why? What made this such a powerhouse, and what does it all mean in the wider context of D&D and popular culture? Ravenloft is just easy to love. And in lack of better words, it's just so identifiable. It's moody, atmospheric, and unlike anything else from D&D at the time of its release. Ravenloft knew what it wanted to be, and it was the first to bring gothic horror to D&D, and more than that, just has good characters and good villains, and we all love a good villain with real understandable motivations. There's a reason that Curse of Strahd is one of, if not the most popular adventure released for 5e. Strahd is just so cool. Speaking of that, it's wild that this whole series, which has lasted for decades, came from that simple question: what is a vampire doing in this cave and what's his deal? And I think that question is really at the heart of the setting. Every Dark Lord has a tragic backstory, and each domain reflects their torment. It all circles back to the motivations of the characters themselves, and that type of narrative-driven gameplay I think is super engaging and is a big reason why people constantly come back to Ravenloft, as well as just being fertile ground for ideas and people to make their own fun little terrible worlds. It's just a great sandbox. Now, other design choices from Ravenloft also had long-lasting effects, like I mentioned, some for better and some for worse, like the adventure path style of play, which you can trace directly back to Ravenloft and Dragonlance. And like I said before, it definitely marked a shift away from the more open-ended sandbox style of play of the old school D&D days, and introduced a more structured, narrative-driven approach that is still so common today and has its own controversies. Now, with that all being said, there is still a lot to love about Ravenloft. Its setting, the atmosphere, and the ability it has to throw you into a world of dark, murderous mystery just make it stand out, and speaks to a larger fascination I think everyone has for the terrifying, the grim, and that want to feel out of your comfort zone. And I think it's safe to say that Ravenloft, despite some of its flaws, has definitely earned its place as one of D&D's most iconic and enduring settings, even if everything in it is trying its very best to terrify, torment, and of course, murder you. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate all the help and support because videos like this take a ton of time and effort, although they are a lot of fun to do. I want to give a huge shout out again to Indie Hawk, who helped me with the Dark Sun video and also helped tremendously with this. Speaking of fact checking, I also want to shout out Paradox as well. And finally, Colby, who also helped with fact checking. Again, no shout out is ever complete without shouting out my incredible patrons who keep this channel alive. Seriously, I could not do this without you guys. Thank you. As always, if you have any suggestions about what you want me to cover next, please let me know. I found out about some seriously cool series thanks to you guys. Anyway, that's all for today. Thanks again. I'll see you next time. Bye.